If you think of Quintric as being a product of two parents, you guys are one of the parents, and we represent the other parent. Okay, so what came in from one parent is expertise on legal tender gold, and what came in from the other parent is expertise on digital currencies and blockchains. There, how about that? This is the voice of mission control. Oh, I like that. Okay, so one thing you may be wondering is, you've probably heard of Bitcoin, you might have heard of Ethereum, and I'm not sure if you've ever heard of our product, even though we're number one. So I'm going to show you how I can stand up here and say that as part of the presentation that we have today. As we had mentioned, my son has developed 3 major blockchains, and just to touch on blockchain again so it doesn't seem like a mystery for you, a blockchain's a 3-ring binder, okay? The rings are the chain, and the pages in there are the blocks, and every 10 minutes you write down all the transactions that happen on a sheet of paper and lock it permanently inside the 3-ring binder. Okay, so there. Blockchain is no mystery. It's just a ledger that is managed by a bunch of honest robots instead of any humans in the loop, in a way that all the robots have to agree before you can put another page in the binder. And therefore you have an incorruptible database on which to do these sort of things. Bitcoin was the first one. It was used to implement a very simple little unmanned company. And the little company only did one function, which was to keep track of who owned its tokens, which you might kind of think of as shares in that company. And so it got value because somebody said, hey, these could be used as currency someday, and people started speculating on a fixed supply of those tokens. And then as people wanted to use those tokens, the services of the company, in order to transfer value, they went up in value because demand exceeded supply. And that's how we got up into the thousands of dollars in value today. So I would argue that Bitcoin is backed by something. It's backed by the services of a company that has something that people want to use in order to access those services. And it'd be no different than really being backed by Apple stock, right? It's got some real backing to it, except that Bitcoin is an unmanned company. There's nobody staying home that can fiddle with the books, so you've got incorruptibility, and now you can get that service and know that that value is going to be preserved without anybody meddling with it. So that's what we started out with. Dan came along and said, well, if you can put a simple company on the blockchain, can't we put a fancier company on the blockchain? How about an entire decentralized exchange that would allow me to issue hundreds of different coins and trade them against each other? What would the services of a company like that be worth? And so that's what he did with BitShares. After that, he created another company called Steam, which is a social media company that pays people to post in digital currency. And those two have value because if you have that currency, you can then vote for other people and have more voting power on voting up posts, and most importantly, you can vote up your own. So he went on and developed Steemit, and then after that, recently, about a year ago, went to do EOS. That's the next layer down. That's like your Microsoft Windows or Mac OS. It's an operating system on which you can build different types of companies like BitShares, on which you can build different types of coins like Bitcoin. So we're fleshing out the whole layers and layers of functionality as we go along. And we're writing Quintric at the very apex, the best possible kind of coin, sitting on the best possible type of exchange, sitting on the best possible type of network operating system. And that is where you find the product that is going to make it popular throughout the world and therefore fill up the UPMA vaults. That's the bottom line. Okay, this just gives you an idea of where we stand today. You can go to blocktivity.info and monitor this at any time. It's basically telling you what are the busiest blockchains, the most heavily used blockchains out there. And if you look at it, you'll see that this week, although it does change from week to week as things ebb and flow in the business, but this week BitShares does about 35% of the transactions of the whole world. Steam does 24%, EOS 11%, and poor little Bitcoin is down there doing maybe 11%. And then below that, Ethereum, 11% as well. And all the rest of the digital currencies out there that you hear occupy that last little wedge, which is maybe 5%. So when I say you're riding on the best technology, if you add up BitShares, Steam, and EOS, which run on our technology, you get, right now, 72%. Sometimes it's as high as 85%. That's the degree at which things are mobile. You've probably only heard of the second pie chart, which shows that Bitcoin is sitting there with 80% of the market value, and that Ethereum has 15%, and everything else fits into that last little wedge. I'd just like you to consider the difference between those two ways of looking at it. Who's number one? The idea of how busy and used something is a leading indicator of potential, right? They're getting used more and more. As you watch that grow, that's a good sign for the system that your product is running on. A lagging indicator is what are the coins worth today? That's sort of an integral of how well it's done in the past. It makes no prediction about what you're going to see in the future. So when I say you're running on the most capable system, that's what I mean. And there's actually, you could think of 3 different ways of determining who's number one. We got Bitcoin, Ethereum, and I'm going to combine BitShares and EOS together because I'm going to tell you in a minute that's what we're doing, putting those 2 functions together to be called BitShares EOS. I'll be announcing that in Amsterdam next week and in Sao Paulo a few days after that, and that'll be kind of our big news, and I'll show you why in a few minutes. But depending upon how you determine which of 3 axes you're going to measure, you determine which is one that you might think is most important. So here's the 3 axes: price, utility, and performance. Bitcoin is a big sumo wrestler in terms of price, okay? Up until the advent of EOS, Ethereum was the most flexible in terms of having the ability to program it. Anybody could program their own smart contract onto Ethereum. EOS now has done a 2nd generation version of that. But performance has fallen to the BitShares EOS technologies that run much faster than the other networks. So which of those 3 things would be important for something like Quintry? And we don't need to change anything, so flexibility is not important. We don't care how much the underlying token of BitShares is worth. We do care how fast we can get it to the other side of the planet. And in the case of Bitcoin, that could take an hour. In the case of our system, 1 second. So if you see, riding on a very efficient system is what's going to allow us to serve all the different applications of a premium type of legal tender currency. This is the situation the industry is facing right now. Utter gridlock on the original Bitcoin and Ethereum networks. Traffic jam, clogged, the systems are used more than they can handle. And anything that's building on those 2 famous chains is going to get basically held up by the fact that there's a traffic jam out there. Well, there is no traffic jam on our network. It's barely 1% loaded, even though it does most of the industry's transactions. Okay, and this is just a picture of Dan Larimer doing his thing going around evangelizing. This is back in 2014 when he stood up in front of the big Bitcoin conference in Las Vegas and told everybody that Bitcoin was obsolete, which made him. What's that? Oh yeah, and that's when he announced stabilized currencies like BitUSD, that far ahead in 2014. And of course, you can imagine standing up at a buggy whip convention and telling them there weren't going to be any more horseless carriages or horse-drawn carriages. It wasn't popular at the time, but it was a premonition. A year later, I stood up in Shanghai and basically told them the same thing. And once again, as you might imagine, crickets, because those industries were using technology that was being made obsolete, so no one wanted to hear it. But fast forward today, we are in a position where it's kind of hard for people to deny it anymore. Wanted to just show you a few things so you get an idea of the difference in performance. The speed of sending $1 somewhere, you know, if you want to wire money someplace, you're going to probably take several days to wire it through the SWIFT system, right? And might cost you $30. And you know, the systems that do that right now, maybe 4,000 transactions per second on Visa, for example. Bitcoin was wonderful when it first came out, just 3 hours or so to transfer, only $3 to transfer. Whereas with BitShares, we're talking about transfers happening under 3 seconds, and with EOS, that's a half second for fractions, that way down around a few pennies, and very high transaction rates so that it can handle all the world's transactions, which of course is going to be very important for the success of Quintry. Okay, and this just gives you the top 5 things, and BitShares is number 1. This week, processing 1.5 million operations per second or per day. Steam is number 2 at over 1 million. EOS is doing 500,000. Ethereum and Bitcoin under 500,000. And they are backlogged, whereas the type of technology is using for the top 3 that you're running on is basically the needle isn't even off 0. They're not even loaded at all. And so if you look at on the 3 scales of what we're talking about, Bitcoin is big in terms of price, almost 0 in terms of performance, and it does have some utility. If you look at Ethereum, which is the second one, it's one of the most flexible out there, got a little more value and a little more performance, but still down in a real slow zone. Up at the other side of the screen is 8 orders of magnitude more effective. And when I say 8 orders of magnitude, that's 8 factors of 10. That's the difference between a Model T and a Starship in terms of total performance of the system. And then BitShares sits over there, not a real big market cap right now, and more utility, but not as, it's not something that anybody can program. EOS comes along and basically stretches the box in all 3 directions. And this is just a little bit of a poke at my competition here. Bitcoin has several different flavors. They've been struggling to move from 3 transactions per second to 7 with their development, and the different types of Bitcoins I just described as fancier and fancier foot bridges. Even Ethereum is only 3 times faster than Bitcoin. It's a little bit fancier shaped footbridge, but it's still just pretty much as slow. Whereas the BitShares EOS superhighway has infinite scalability, and therefore that's the system your coin is riding on. And then the final thing that I will comment on is something that we're going to do, and you heard it here first, just for you. I was going to save it and announce it next week. Don't tell anybody, okay? But we're actually going to be taking the combined system and launching it into space. So there will be a satellite launch in November, put the first one into space. As you can see, it's a little bit hard to look at right now, but it'll be a polar orbit. The Earth will turn under it, and basically it'll give connectivity to do processing in space. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, one of the things our new generation of software does is what I call jurisdictional agility. It can actually allow any given company that you put on there to operate it to choose what jurisdiction it's going to operate in. So if you don't like the regulations in one jurisdiction, you can put your company so it only runs in the jurisdictions you care about. Right now, Bitcoin and all the others are running in all jurisdictions, which means you have to be concerned with all the laws that might apply. With this, we can set it so that we could run it in international space if we wanted to. Or as you heard earlier, we can run it solely in Utah, where we're subject only to the laws of Utah and not any interstate commerce type of complications where we have to deal with multiple states and therefore federal government intervening. So this is one of the most exciting things that we've got going, and that you'll be hearing about that. The satellite will be launched in November, and by the 4th of July, we'll be allowing people to run their smart contracts anywhere they want in the jurisdiction that most suits what their business wants to do. And my final point here is the fact that Quintric is not just, let's have a digital token that represents gold. Yeah, that's great. No, we want it to be used as a currency. We want it to be zooming all around the world, supporting all of the different applications like Michael talked about. We want sub-second transactions. We want automated companies up in the sky that are able to use the Quintric as a form of automated settlement, automated payment that will basically bring about something that I call zero economic friction. And friction, of course, is something that right now, every time we have to wait for payment or wait for regulations and so on, it slows down our prosperity. When we get to the point where there's no friction, we get economic superconductivity, now we can see new levels of prosperity projected anywhere in the world. So that's where Quintric is headed. That's where UPMA's vast quantity of gold are going to be backing this type of system, and that's why we're excited about it.